I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and trends in mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by Frank Menchaca, sponsor of the SAE Battery Global Traceability Committee. On today's episode, we'll discuss how SAE's new J3327 standard is increasing transparency through traceability of the battery supply chain. We hope you enjoy this episode. At COMVEC 2025, you're not just attending a conference, you're stepping into the center of the commercial vehicle industry's transformation. Over 3 days, leaders from PACCAR, along with 60 plus executive council members from OEMs, suppliers, governments, and academia will tackle real-world propulsion strategies, battery degradation, and software-defined vehicle architectures. The agenda hits hard: zero-emission roadmaps, cybersecurity for AI-powered trucks, system-level electrification, and ADAS validation, all shaped by voices who build, regulate, and deploy at scale. If your team is serious about advancing technology, upskilling talent, and staying ahead of regulatory disruption, this is the room you need to be in. COMVEC. This is where the industry's next chapter begins. Do not get left behind. Frank, it's great to see you. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Grayson. It's great to be back.
It's great to have you here. You and I know the battery supply chain. I'll use the term, Frank. It's complex to say the least, but you're there. You're rolling your sleeves up. Truly, how complex is this supply chain?
So it's a great question. It is complex. When you start to think about the fact that every battery has materials in it, chemicals in it, critical minerals in it, those critical minerals are sourced in any number of places. So you can have critical minerals sourced in China. You can have critical minerals sourced in Chile. Those critical minerals are mixed with other materials that are sourced somewhere else. So you have from just material extraction point of view, materials that are coming out of different areas, as many as a dozen or half a dozen, at a time. And then when you layer in the fact that those materials are being mixed with constituent materials that for manufacturing and processing, and those materials could be coming from Michigan, they could be coming from Ohio, that they could be coming from Mexico. And the fact that that mix is then being produced or manufactured in South Carolina or Alabama. You have a geographically very complex ecosystem that has evolved around batteries.
And to me, I don't bake, but it sounds like you're trying to make a Betty Crocker cake. It's very complex and very hard to follow where everything's coming from. And then you have the Congo, and you have all the issues with the Congo around the cobalt, and you're putting it into, let's call it a big mixing pot. How do you, I know we're going to get this in a minute, but you're working on traceability. How do you track everything since you have things from the Congo, from Chile, from China, and then it's all going into like a big mixer, but how do you track and follow all this?
Yeah, so that's really the essence of a traceability system. The International Energy Agency has a great quote about this. Traceability systems can enable the collection of data on product origin, geographic path, and the sequence of entities that held ownership or control over the product and its physical evolution. That's kind of the essence of it. I think a good traceability system enables the identification of the material when it's extracted, what its geographic path is, and the definition puts it, the sequence of entities that held ownership. So ownership or control of the material. There are so many different players that it's really going to become necessary to understand where this material is coming from for all sorts of reasons. There's tariff reasons within the United States. There is forced labor laws that have to be followed. There's foreign entities that need to be tracked. So really the essence of a traceability system is to kind of put that order and logic and identification and transparency around where the material is coming from, who's touching it, and what they're doing with it.
So I'll ask you a question. So a while ago, I reread Vault Rush by Henry Sanderson. It was really interesting. And there was a lot of, I would say, you could make a great movie. I have a lot of vivid things that stood out in the book to me. One of them was he talked about the Congo and cobalt, how kids will basically just go, because it's not very deep, grab the cobalt and go sell it to an entity, I'll use a practical term, at the end of the street. How is that tracked, since there are, say, a variety of individuals that take it and then go sell to an entity? Does the tracking start at the entity that pays the children, or how is that all tracked?
Yeah. So ultimately, what our traceability system looks at and what's being done in the EU, it says that any manufacturer that is going to be using this material is ultimately responsible for creating the identification, creating the traceability label, if you like. And then within different jurisdictions, there are different requirements about how you have to disclose foreign entities and what those entities are doing. So, for example, under the latest legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill, there is something called the prohibited foreign entity, so China, South Korea, Russia, and so forth, that you have to identify in order to qualify for the IRS tax credits, the 45X production tax credits. But then there's also something called the foreign influenced entity, which really looks at companies that have some kind of stake or leadership, from one of those countries. And then there is the material assistance from one of those countries. So what you have growing up is this ecosystem of concern for where the material is coming from, who's touching it, and how they're sourcing it. What kind of labor practices are they using? And all of that really becomes a lot more transparent in a consistent traceability system. And, I feel like with SAE J3327, which is the standard that I'm responsible for, we set the foundation for identifying and collecting that data. And the next step is really making those data verifiable, be able to put in place a system of trust and verification. And that's what the Europeans are looking for as well. So back to your question, how do you know, how can you tell where the material is coming from, who's touching it, and how it's being sourced? It's really the essence of a traceability system to identify where the material is being sourced. And not only that, but to have a system of verification on top of that says, yes, we've checked, and to the best of our knowledge, that is correct, or it's not correct. And you have a player within the value chain who's not being straight about where they're getting their material.
No, and I'm going to remove the company's name for privacy purposes, but I will say the Financial Times has done a wonderful job tracking this, and there is a very large, if you want to call it, broker dealer, any term you want to use, and I'll remove their name from this. They got indicted for a suspected bribery, and we'll leave the company's name for influencing the trade there. How do you verify that? Do you look at Financial Times reports? Do you look at, in America, do you look at SEC filings? In the UK, do you look at sort of their government filings? Is that what you kind of look for to verify the quote unquote influence?
Yeah, so it's a variety of things. In the US, for the tax credits, a lot of that due diligence is being done by the Department of Energy, and they've got some great people who are working on that. There are third-party entities that are coming up now that are essentially selling verifiability schemes, and so there's that. And then in the EU, for example, within the European Digital Product Passport for batteries, you have a requirement for public disclosure, of where those materials are coming from. So I would say that you have a landscape that is taking many different routes toward not only identifying the material, identifying the data related to critical minerals, but also requiring to different degrees a level of verification around them.
So there's a lot of, I'll use the term, it's a very complex database is what you're working on. From a technology standpoint, how are you inputting and tracking all these, since you have human labor involved, you have shipping involved, you have refining involved? How are you, from a technology layer, tracking all these elements that are going into the database?
Yeah, so in essence, the digital product passport for batteries on the EU side uses a system of unique identifiers. So very simply, unique character string for identifying the product. There's something called the globally unique identifier, which enables the material or the information to be included in the digital product passport. That is married up with a QR code or some other RFID system. Again, on the US side, we're not requiring a particular format, but what we're saying is this information has to be captured in a digital record that can then be reproduced, whether it's an RFID or a QR code or what have you. So I think what seems to be evolving is this idea of a digital label, if you like. I mean, the Europeans call it a passport. Some people kind of object to that. A digital label that goes with the battery, that travels throughout its life cycle, that records the material that's being included, the chemistry, where it's coming from, and also records the changes that battery has gone through. So if it's, for example, if it's taken out of the car, that's something that needs to be known. And then, developing the standard, we got into many discussions about this. So what do you do at the end of life? Like, let's say, for example, that the battery is now going to be reduced to black mass. Then, presumably the label starts all over again, right? Because that material is now ready for a new identification and a new life. The same is true for batteries that are going to be used in second life. You need to know that this particular battery came from a particular vehicle, no longer is in that vehicle, has now embarked on a second life. So one of the things that the standard does is codify the entire life cycle of the battery. So you have kind of a combination of factors. You have the label, the identification system, and then you have a nomenclature that gets layered on top of that identifies the life cycle of the battery and gives a vocabulary for where that is. So first life is battery is created, goes into a vehicle. That battery is matched up with a vehicle identification number, and is sold, goes into the market. As the lingo goes, it's put into service, and we record all of those things within the data structure. And then it's decided, okay, that battery is going to be reused either in second life, that has to get recorded, or it's going to be pulped and made into black mass, and it starts all over again. So what we set out to do was to provide a vocabulary and a methodology for describing that whole life cycle.
Well, just the life cycle is going to keep going and going. But going back to, let's say, pre-life, when it's still raw material and you build the traceability, are you building that by the metric ton and say, okay, this metric ton has, I'll use the term, I know it's probably not right, but the VIN number, you give it this traceability ID and it starts that metric ton. And then what happens when it breaks up and then gets refined and eventually goes into a battery? Do those numbers say you have A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3? How does that look?
Yeah, I think you're directionally correct. So we want to know the battery mass measured in kilograms, and we want to know what the constituent materials, what the critical materials are in that battery mass. So along with the standard, we created a technical paper that will be published along with the standard that actually does an implementation case study. And so we said, okay, if someone came to me, Frank, and said, here's the standard, Frank, I need you to implement it, how would I do it? That was a question that I asked. And so it turned out to be a very useful exercise. So I worked with my co-author, Jim Gaheen, who's a committee member, and we created a technical paper that actually follows this along. And so we said, we're going to track 6 kilograms of lithium that comes in from rock and from brine for the anode and the cathode. And we are going to track how that material changes with each successive step in its development. So we use an accounting system called mass balance accounting that basically says we're going to measure that material incoming, and then whatever changes it goes through, we're going to measure it outgoing. And we followed that through the entire battery process, all the way up to the cell and pack creation. And I think to do true traceability, that's kind of what you have to do. There are other accounting methods that you can use. We happen to use mass balance. There's a good ISO standard for this. We wanted to make sure that whatever we did was going to be compliant with international norms, because we wanted to create a global standard. So there is a way to do this where you identify the material and you follow it step by step by recording changes to its mass in kilograms as it goes through the stages of processing and manufacturing.
Was one of the overarching reasons for the standard to breathe transparency into a traditionally opaque market?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I would say yes. Maybe there's something even more general behind it. So we brought, and when I say we, it's the Department of Energy under the flag of LIBridge, which is a program of the Department of Energy that it's administered through Argonne National Labs. Last August, almost a full year ago, we brought together representatives from 50 companies, large OEMs, battery manufacturers, mining supply, every part of the supply chain. We brought them all together at Argonne National Labs in just outside of Chicago, and we said, so traceability. What's the landscape for traceability? How do companies feel about it? There's the EU Digital Product Passport for batteries. That's on the horizon. How are you thinking about this? And the long and the short of it was the impetus for the standard was really the market saying we need some kind of organizing principle around this. Some companies are planning to be complying with the EU Digital Product Passport. Some are not. Some haven't sorted their thinking out. And so what came out of that discussion, Grayson, was something that was really clear message from the market saying we need some kind of consistent structure for thinking about this. And so that's really where it came from. It was a call from the market itself for us to do this.
And then do you see, if you look at the EU, I'll use the term vulgar, the GDPR, where some people comply with it, some people don't. Was the goal of the standard kind of become this overarching thing where you can go across borders and individuals can agree to build to a standard that allows scalability across the entire global market?
Yeah, 100%. That was the idea. So what we decided to do was to meet the market where it is. In the US, there is definitely an understanding of the need for traceability. There was, I think, some resistance to some aspects of the EU Digital Product Passport, namely around things like carbon footprinting. And then there was a great deal of concern about public disclosure of the contents of the batteries, because this is a competitive advantage for a lot of the market. And so we decided we're going to meet the market where it is. We're going to create a standard that allows them to comply with basic parts of the digital product passport, but not require the public disclosure and not require the carbon footprinting. And that turned out to be a pretty good decision, because we got industry on board along with government. We got the standard done in 8 months from start to finish, which is super fast. The average time is 18 to 36 months. And the other thing I should say is that we had people in the committee who worked on the specifications for the EU Digital Product Passport. And we had folks from Asia. It was really a global effort to make this happen.
Building a standards committee, there's a lot of egos. How much compromise had to happen to develop the standard in a record time of 8 months?
Yeah, so my job as the committee chair and the document sponsor, as I like to say, my job was to drive straight down the middle. Obviously you have entities that are in there that are campaigning for certain things in their own interest. You're always going to have that. The standardization process, particularly the way, SAE does it, is really to try and synthesize the perspective of industry to the greatest degree possible outside of personal interest. And that's really where it comes down to the practice, as I like to say, steering it down the middle. And the other thing that I would say that made this possible in 8 months, we had a very well-defined use case. We didn't spend a lot of time saying, what are we here to do? We heard from the market. That was hugely helpful. The market said, basically, I need this standard to do 5, 6 different things at the most. And so there's always the possibility of scope creep. And people would say, well, what about this? And I hear you. I know this is important. I'm not saying we're not going to get to it. For this particular iteration of the standard, we're going to stick to the script. And that's really how it came together.
I give you a lot of credit that it came together this quickly. So the standard's now completed. How is it going to be deployed? Because there's millions of battery cells out there in the market. How do you see it being deployed and implemented?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we are now, as soon as this is published, we'll open another iteration of the standard. We'll start updating it. Just as important, we're going to start piloting it. So we have several OEMs that have put up their hands to say, we're going to use this and we're going to road test it for you. And that will, any feedback that they have, positive or negative, will go into the next iteration of the standard. So there'll be that. In addition to that, we're holding a set of 3 webinars to talk about the standard. One will be with all those 50 companies that came together at Argonne National Labs. We're going to bring them back and we're going to say, you told us this, here's what we did. Does this meet your expectation? And most of them are on the committee anyway. So I'm expecting that one to kind of go okay. The second, which will be at the North American Battery Show in October, will bring in battery companies that are dealing with defense and data storage. Because although this ostensibly focuses on EV batteries are kind of leading the way to this broader battery ecosystem. And it is super important for providers of defense batteries and batteries that are going into AI data centers to know about this, because the same considerations apply. And so we'll be socializing it with those companies, and we hope to set up some pilots. And then the third webinar will actually be in November in Washington, D.C., where we're going to bring government entities together and have them understand how this standard can be used so that it can be deployed across multiple domains. Department of Defense, EPA, Department of Energy, NHTSA, and so forth.
It makes a lot of sense with the DoD because the Department of Defense and the Secretary has been very vocal about eVTOLs. He's been very vocal about drones and want to made in America, all the components made in America. And we've seen what happened with telecom communications. But I have to ask you the big question with the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room, China. They've been doing battery traceability since 2018 through their NEV program. What lessons did you learn from that approach? Is China going to adapt this standard, and how does the standard that you've built differ?
Yes. So interestingly, we did have people from China work on the standard, and they did. We took input from folks who work for CATL, which is the largest battery company in the world. The Chinese are significantly ahead, and so it would be foolish to disregard input. So we took input from the Chinese, and we took input from Europe, and we tried to once again drive it down the middle. Balance the national interests of those areas with what industry was telling us. That was always my touchstone. Like, go back to what industry is telling you to do. And so we did take their input, and we're hopeful that, and we're in a few weeks, I'll be going out again to Argonne to talk with ANSI, which is the overseeing body of American standards development organizations. The thing that we're looking at there is, how do we have a coordinated U.S. strategy around critical mineral standards? And this is something we're talking about because we want the U.S. to be interfacing with ISO, International Standards Organization, on helping to set global standards that everyone can follow. And so it's a kind of multifaceted thing, but I think the U.S. is realizing that it has to coordinate its standards development organizations in order to really work in cooperation with ISO and truly be creating global standards.
It has to be global. If you look at interest, you have Western Australia with the booming mining. Did you have to balance any of those? If you're playing referee down the middle, did you have to push back on any influence that those, say, organizations or representatives had?
It's interesting. The Australians were very easy to work with, very good to work with. They have a lot of experience, and they have a unique set of conditions, right? Geographically a little bit different from the United States. Many lessons learned, on their side. So they were, they were pretty good citizens as far as all that goes.
If you look at it in Norway now, obviously, they're known for their oil and gas fund, but now, as you see in the northern part of their country, they're starting to open up the mines for these minerals. As the standards develop and it gets global, will you start working directly with the miners and the mines to start implementing the standard at that level, at a global level?
Yeah, so we, as I mentioned, when we brought those companies together at Argonne, we had companies that are in the material extraction business. So they were there from the beginning. Our hope is that they will be using it because the standard does call for identification of the material, who extracted it, where it was extracted, and when. And so, the what we hope will happen with this standard is that the organization that's creating it is going to be a manufacturer. They can use this standard, give it to their supply chain and say, I need you to follow this. And it makes life easier for everyone. It's one consistent way of doing things. They can begin to capture data that might be, labeled lots of different things. And we start to move the industry toward a more consolidated approach, a more consistent approach. It's going to take a while. I don't want to overpromise that, overnight we're going to go to this, kind of seamless system. But the way that we think about this standard is that we laid the foundation work for a coordinated and coherent traceability system.
Without a foundation, you can't build a house. That's the first place to start. When you, in the standard, are there any security measures so somebody doesn't try and fudge or manipulate the data from a tracking perspective so you have the integrity the whole way through?
Yeah, so we did not try and tackle verifiability in the first iteration of the standard. We said we need to identify what data needs to be collected, and how do we want you to collect it. So that was kind of step one. And now, as we move into the second phase, we first we have updates that we need to do, to things like 45X and so forth. But we also need to start thinking about how this is going to be verified. So those listeners who know SAE know that on the aerospace side, there are some really pretty good verification systems. There's the National Accreditation of Defense Contractors Program, or NADCAP, that SAE's PRI business covers. So I think, there are some good models that we can borrow from other industries. I think aerospace is very good because, you have counterfeit parts and, things that have to be secured, for safe aerospace travel. So now, the next step is to say, okay, how do we begin to think about this kind of verification scheme around the data that we've now kind of laid the foundation for?
And staying on the next step theme, the current iteration of the standard, it tracks applicable critical materials, lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite. As it evolves, let's say 2.0, 3.0, will you track other types of materials as well, or will it always stay with the applicable critical materials?
Yeah, so applicable critical minerals is actually a pretty big category. So it is any mineral that, if purified or converted, are considered to be essential to a country's economy and key industries. So the materials that you mentioned are certainly of interest. They're a major part of the battery world, but there's something like 30 other critical minerals that we include requirements for, things like titanium, for example, or, niobium or palladium or tellurium, materials that are used for example, in magnets for turbine engines. So, there are many, many other critical minerals in addition to the ones that are critical for battery energy that we asked for information on. And then we make the point in the standard that this is a dynamic area. There are executive orders that continue to be signed around critical minerals. Copper was recently cited. So we'll just, this standard will have an ongoing life, that is going to be iterated on.
Within the ongoing life of the standard, people pass, they go on to new jobs. How do you bring new individuals into the committee, or you bring new scientific papers or approaches to this? How do you start integrating that over time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I spend a lot of time when I'm not, working with the committee, I spend a lot of time out speaking about what we're doing, recruiting companies, and recruiting. It's super, super important to be recruiting what I would call non-traditional companies, so new entrants, into this space. Just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk at the NatBat, which is the industry trade group, talk on recycling and supply chain management. to all sorts of companies, big, recognizable household names to companies that are just kind of getting started in this area. So I think you have to be out talking about it, presenting on it, and really making people aware of it. And that goes back to that whole sort of socialization program around these webinars that we're doing.
You just have to have a conversation. Say, hi, I'm Frank. This is the standard we're developing. How can we help you? It goes a long way. There's different size players in this area. You have some very multi-billion-dollar players, and you have some smaller industries. Is there anything in the standard, or any provision for different size players in the market, either based on market cap, based on availability? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things we thought a lot about, so we had one OEM that I spent some time with. They were very kind. They put me in touch with the person whose job it is to do the traceability stuff for the tax credits. So I spent time with him, and he told me, like, if this goes through, you're going to make my life a lot easier, And I thought, okay, this company, it's a household name. They are already going to have a leg up because they've got a whole tracking system. They know exactly where their materials are coming from, but not every company has their resources. So as a result, in the appendix of the standard, we include models for creating battery records. There's something called the Battery Registry, which is a free, decentralized database. And the person who is responsible for that was a committee member. And that is a very useful tool that enables companies to without, this big infrastructure, to say, we can use this decentralized database in order to record our battery information and create our labels. So, and it's free of charge, and it's provided, with government support out there. So we included that as a model. We're saying you don't have to follow this, but if you want to, it's free and it's available. We offer calculations, sample calculations, for things like value-added services and things of that nature. So we really tried to take a kind of user-centered approach to this standard and say, how can we make this useful and easiest for people from a variety of backgrounds to be able to use? We wanted to make the barrier of entry into traceability low.
If the barrier is low, the adoption curve is going to go up. We can just look at history to prove it that. In the standard, and I think you will. I don't think you hope so. I know you will, because if it's complex, people put their hands up, I have to hire somebody because they won't do it. In the standard, there was a mention of value-added services that need to be tracked. What are these services? What does it look like in practice? And is there any impact on those smaller corporations?
Yeah, so value-added services are a function of the tax credits. And essentially, what they mean are, services or content that's added to the battery. That might be testing. It might be quality control. It might be the battery management system that ensures better performance, safer performance of a manufacturer's batteries. We're very interested in those because those can be, first of all, there's a tax credit for value-added services, and then those are very useful for industry to know about. And so we look to companies to tell us about those as part of their battery label.
Let's look to the future, because you're really good at looking to the future here. How do you see this standard evolving as, let's see, the circular economy truly becomes a circular economy, and new battery chemistries that haven't been invented yet come to be reality?
Yeah. So I think, one of the aspirations, one of the objectives of this standard was to create a global vocabulary, one way of talking about things, because that clarifies, that helps collaboration. A consistent methodology for capturing data. We look forward to a time when we can have a verification system that countries around the world can trust. And that's really where the future of this standard is going. And then there's the question of information security. So we have, folks who are joining, actually just beginning to join the committee, that have experience in cybersecurity, because it's, as you know, with cybersecurity, it's never a question of preventing attacks. You're always going to have attacks. You just need to have a protocol for dealing with them. And so when information, is being falsified, how do we have a programmatic way of answering that? There's also, the security. We have a lot of conversation about this, the security of the battery management system. If a foreign entity is manufacturing a battery management system, that effectively gives them control of what that battery does. Battery management systems enable the battery to, mitigate thermal runaway, battery fires, which can be very dangerous. And so, who creates those battery management systems essentially controls that. And that's a security concern, for defense batteries. That's a huge security concern. And so we look to the future of the standard to help to begin to create transparency and security around all of those things. And so, what I would say is we have been very purposeful in working with other organizations. We don't want to do this in a vacuum. We don't want to do it alone. And we don't want to do anything that duplicates or overlaps what's being done. So we had, as I said, folks from Asia, folks from Europe, folks from many, many different industries, and now increasingly the cyber industry, to be part of this so that we can put the pieces in place to really make this comprehensive.
Do you see the verification system, or I'll use the term layer, living at an NGO such as the UN, or where do you see that living to have that global adoption?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about this. And I'm speaking just for myself now, I like very much decentralized authorities. There's ways to do this, for example, through blockchain, technologies where you have a decentralized but authoritative system in place. I think the information is too voluminous and it's too sensitive to sit with any one entity. And so some kind of decentralized program, I think, is the way to go. That said, we haven't, figured that out yet. I think the national labs in the United States have a great role to play in this. Standards development organizations like SAE and ASTM, I think, have a role to play. But I have a hard time thinking about any one entity that could do all of this. So,
well, if you look at the growth of decentralized finance, that's growing, and now it's at the big banks. JP Morgan's very out there, and the traceability on blockchain. So perhaps you're on something. What we do know is that the standard's going to evolve, because that's what standard's doing. That you're going to be leading the charge to give much needed transparency to batteries, not just for EVs, but for drones, for data centers, and whatever's going to be invented next. And Frank, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
What I would like people to understand is traceability is critical to national security. It's critical to defense. It's critical to data storage. We see all of these companies now wanting the U.S. to become competitive in AI. It's critical for that. So a lot of people, when they think about batteries, large batteries, they think about EVs. EVs are super important, right? They're no less important than they were. And there are all of these other applications. So our connections in cybersecurity say, you don't have to be an environmentalist to love traceability. And nor do you have to be, as they put it, a dragon slayer either. You don't have to be, a hawk, and you don't have to be an environmentalist. You can commit to circular economy, not only because it's good for defense and it's good for data storage and it's good for transportation and it's good for the environment. You can do all of those things with the traceability system.
I'll summarize it this way, Frank. Traceability matters.
100%.
Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow is today. The future is battery traceability. Frank, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Thanks for having me, Grayson.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. Be sure to join us next week as we explore the EU's approach to regulating autonomous vehicles.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.